Within just 60 minutes of King Charles III signing and verifying the letters patent 2026, the tone between London and Montecito shifted instantly, from quiet diplomatic tension to full-scale legal confrontation. Meghan Markle didn't respond with a public statement or an emotional interview like many expected. Instead, she moved with precision, activating a pre-prepared legal team in Los Angeles and turning her California estate into a command center for international litigation. This wasn't emotional, it was strategic. Reports from top-tier California law firms suggest that she's challenging the very foundation of royal authority, attempting to bypass the monarch's power using American civil law and international human rights frameworks. Her first move was assembling an elite group of attorneys specializing in constitutional and intellectual property law, diving deep into the 2026 decree line by line. The goal is clear: reframe the reclassification of Archie and Lilibet as private citizens not as a royal decision, but as a violation of their birthrights. She's focusing heavily on the 183-day residency rule, arguing that it unfairly punishes minors who cannot legally fulfill royal duties, and presenting it as a retroactive measure meant to strip identity. Her argument goes even further, claiming that royal status granted at birth under the 1917 conventions is not a privilege that can be revoked, but a permanent personal right. But beyond legal theory, her real focus lies in control, specifically, control of royal symbolism. While the palace operates within constitutional boundaries, Meghan has moved quickly to secure commercial dominance. Almost immediately after the King's announcement, her legal team filed trademark applications in the United States for Prince Archie of Sussex, Princess Lilibet of Sussex, and House of Sussex Global. This creates a striking contradiction. While titles may be removed in the UK, she aims to own them as commercial assets in the US. By doing this, she's building a legal barrier around those names, ensuring that any unauthorized use by media or businesses could trigger major lawsuits. It's a calculated move to protect what she sees as a massive financial ecosystem. Meghan understands that in a global market, even a disputed title still carries immense value. It opens doors to investors, branding, and influence. For those backing her ventures, it's not about products, it's about proximity to royalty. If Archie and Lilibet are seen as ordinary citizens, the entire Sussex brand loses its edge. And that's why she's prepared to escalate even further. Quiet rumors have begun circulating about a private archive, containing recordings, internal memos, and sensitive material from inside the palace. The message behind those whispers is clear: if the monarchy uses law to cut off her children's heritage, she may use information to challenge its reputation. At this point, she's no longer just acting as a mother. She's operating as a strategist determined to protect and expand a global brand she's spent years building. As the impact of the letters patent 2026 intensified around April 25, Meghan Markle shifted her approach from defensive legal positioning to a far more aggressive expansion of intellectual property control, directly challenging the centuries-old authority of the British monarchy. Rather than appealing to family ties or public sympathy, she focused on something far more powerful in the modern world: ownership. Recognizing that King Charles III and Prince William had effectively limited her children's royal status through residency and service rules, Meghan chose not to fight that battle on constitutional grounds alone. Instead, she turned to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, aiming to secure full commercial rights over the names and identities of her children. Her strategy was precise and business-driven. If she couldn't control the legal reality of royal titles in the UK, she would dominate their commercial value globally. Through a newly structured Delaware-based entity, her legal team filed a wide range of trademark applications for Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex, covering industries like entertainment, luxury goods, publishing, and digital media. This move was intentionally designed to operate outside British jurisdiction, creating a parallel system where the prestige of royal titles could exist independently as private assets. Meghan's thinking was rooted in a clear market reality. Even if the palace removed official recognition, the names themselves still held enormous influence, especially in American and Asian markets. By separating the monarchy's symbolic value from its institutional control, she aimed to turn what was once a public identity into a private revenue stream. Publicly, her team framed this as a protective measure, to prevent misuse of her children's names by third parties, but the deeper strategy suggested something more disruptive. By locking down these trademarks, she was effectively building a private version of royalty, one that could operate without approval from London. In this model, any media outlet, brand, or publisher wanting to use those names with their royal titles would need permission, or risk serious legal consequences. The titles themselves were being repositioned as high-value assets, untouchable by the crown yet fully exploitable in the global marketplace. At the core of this strategy were massive financial stakes. Meghan's ongoing efforts to secure over $100 million in venture capital for her lifestyle brand depended heavily on maintaining the perception of her children as royal figures. Investors weren't simply buying into products, they were investing in status, image, and access to a royal narrative. She clearly understood that even a weakened or unofficial title still carried immense power in elite financial circles. For her, these titles were not about duty or tradition, but about leverage, tools to build a global brand. Tensions escalated further when her legal team issued formal warnings to major media organizations, cautioning against unauthorized use of her children's names or images in ways that suggested a connection to the British Crown without her approval. This signaled a clear attempt to control the narrative itself. Meghan was betting that American trademark law could provide stronger, more flexible protection than traditional royal protocols. In her view, the monarchy was no longer just a family or institution, it was a legacy brand that had failed to protect its own commercial value. This revealed a deep strategic divide. While the crown was focused on long-term stability and tradition, Meghan was operating in a fast-moving world of investments, quarterly returns, and brand positioning. She reportedly made it clear to her advisors that she would rather hold a title that had commercial power in the United States, even if it lacked official recognition, than rely on one that could be taken away by the British establishment. By securing these trademarks, she aimed to outmaneuver the residency requirements entirely. Even if her children never met the conditions to be recognized as active royals, their names would remain active, protected, and profitable across the global economy. What emerged from this was something entirely new, a form of privatized royalty, where titles were no longer tied to duty or geography, but to ownership and control. In this new model, the authority of the crown was being challenged not through rebellion, but through contracts, trademarks, and global commerce, all driven by a duchess determined to turn royal legacy into a powerful business empire. As her legal strategy in the United States continued to build a strong commercial shield around the Sussex identity, Meghan Markle shifted into a far more intense phase, one focused on shaping perception and destabilizing the moral image of the monarchy itself. By the end of April 2026, it was clear that she was no longer just defending her children's status, but actively working to recast the entire House of Windsor as cold, outdated, and fundamentally unjust. This wasn't random, it was a calculated pivot from legal filings to narrative control, designed to position King Charles III and Prince William as the aggressors in a global story. Her goal was to turn a complex constitutional decision into something far more emotional, a human rights issue that would resonate with a global audience, while at the same time protecting her growing commercial interests under the image of a mother fighting for her children. At the center of this strategy was something insiders began calling the Sussex Archive, a private collection reportedly containing audio recordings, personal journals, and encrypted communications gathered during her time as a working royal. This archive wasn't just meant for defense, it was designed as leverage. The message behind it was clear: if the monarchy used legal power to distance her children from their royal identity, she could respond by exposing internal realities that might damage the institution's global reputation. By quietly allowing hints of these materials to reach selected media outlets, she created a sense of uncertainty within palace circles, forcing decision-makers to consider not just legal outcomes, but the risk of public fallout. At the same time, Meghan's team began carefully shaping public opinion by framing the 183-day residency rule as something much harsher, a form of modern exile. Through strategic leaks and legal arguments, they suggested that the palace was placing her in an impossible position, forcing her to choose between her children's safety in the United States and their inherited identity in the United Kingdom. The reclassification of Archie and Lilibet was presented not as policy, but as punishment, directed at minors who had no control over their circumstances. This narrative aimed to spark emotional reactions, turning a technical legal matter into a deeply personal story of family division, where a grandfather appeared to be rejecting his own grandchildren for the sake of control and public image. The The strategy went even deeper when her team began circulating sensitive claims related to an internal initiative known as Project Silver. According to these suggestions, Prince William had been a key force behind long-term plans to reduce the size of the monarchy, with the Sussex children identified as targets as early as 2024. By presenting William as a calculated strategist and Charles as someone enforcing that vision, Meghan aimed to shift full responsibility for the conflict onto the royal establishment in London. This wasn't just about the present, it was about shaping the future, ensuring that William's eventual reign would carry the shadow of these accusations. At the same time, this entire narrative was being integrated into her media projects. Production for a documentary series titled Citizens of Nowhere was accelerated, with reports suggesting that Meghan deliberately included real-time reactions to legal developments, capturing personal moments as part of a larger storytelling strategy. The idea was clear: transforming her exclusion from the monarchy into compelling global content. She understood that while a traditional royal title might fade in value, the story of someone being pushed out by a powerful institution could capture far greater attention. In her view, public interest in royal drama could outweigh institutional authority. By presenting herself as someone standing up to an outdated system, she aimed to align with modern audiences who value independence and personal rights. Framing the situation as a fight for her children allowed her to maintain both emotional and commercial strength, even as official recognition from the palace weakened. In this phase, what emerged was a new kind of strategy, one where narrative itself became a weapon. Every detail, every claim, and every piece of content was carefully positioned to maximize impact. The idea was simple but powerful. In a digital world, perception can be more influential than formal titles. Through this approach, Meghan wasn't just reacting to the monarchy, she was attempting to redefine how its authority is understood, using storytelling, legal pressure, and public emotion as interconnected tools in a much larger global strategy. The momentum of this narrative-driven strategy reached a critical turning point when it met its strongest resistance in Princess Anne, a figure known for her discipline and unwavering loyalty to the crown. While King Charles III remained focused on the weight of leadership and Prince William concentrated on the monarchy's long-term future, and stepped in with a far more direct and uncompromising approach. She did not view Meghan Markle's actions as a personal family conflict, but as a calculated attempt to weaken the authority of the British state for private gain. Instead of engaging publicly or emotionally, Anne moved with precision, targeting the very structure that supported Meghan's growing commercial ambitions. Her strategy was rooted in institutional power. With deep connections across government, trade, and legal networks, she understood how to respond to a challenge that combined branding, law, and global markets. Her first major move was aimed directly at the economic core of Meghan's plans. Working alongside the UK's Department for Business and Trade and international legal partners, she helped push forward a global directive addressing the unauthorized commercial use of royal titles and symbols. The message was firm: any use of titles like Prince, Princess, or Duchess for private profit without proper authorization could be treated as a violation of the Crown's intellectual property and potentially as deceptive business practice. The effect was immediate. Major global platforms and retailers that Meghan had been targeting for partnerships suddenly found themselves in a difficult position. Aligning with the Sussex brand now carried legal and diplomatic risks tied to the United Kingdom. Under this pressure, companies like Amazon and Shopify began reviewing their policies on products connected to royal branding. Items using the names Archie or Lilibet alongside royal titles were flagged as potentially infringing on sovereign rights. In a single, carefully executed move, Anne managed to transform Meghan's trademark strategy into a liability, making those assets far less attractive to major distributors. At the same time, she escalated the response on the legal front. While Meghan's team was securing trademarks in the United States, Anne's legal advisors prepared a counteraction within the same jurisdiction. They filed claims arguing that the commercial use of these titles could mislead consumers and represent an improper use of cultural heritage. By reframing the issue as one of consumer protection and legal accuracy, Anne shifted the narrative away from prestige and toward accountability. This had a ripple effect in financial circles. Investors who had once seen the Sussex brand as a high-value opportunity began to reconsider. The involvement of the British state signaled that this was no longer just a branding battle, it had become a complex legal and diplomatic issue. Funding slowed, and what had been seen as a promising multi-million-dollar venture started to look increasingly unstable. But Anne's response didn't stop at economics or law. She also moved to limit the political connections Meghan had been building. Using her established influence in diplomatic and governmental networks, she communicated clearly with officials in Washington, emphasizing that decisions about royal status were matters of constitutional importance for the United Kingdom. Any external involvement, especially from political figures, could be viewed as interference. This message had a noticeable impact. Support that Meghan may have expected from influential circles in the United States became far more cautious, as maintaining strong international relations took priority. Finally, and addressed the moral narrative that had been gaining momentum. Instead of responding with counter-accusations, she authorized the release of internal financial records from the Sussexes' time as working royals. These documents suggested that efforts to secure trademarks and build commercial ventures had begun well before their official departure. This shifted public perception in a significant way. What had been framed as a protective effort for family began to look, to some, like a long-term business strategy. The emotional narrative lost some of its strength, replaced by questions about timing and intent. By the end of this phase, Anne had systematically challenged Meghan's position on multiple fronts, economic, legal, political, and reputational, demonstrating that the monarchy's strength does not rely on public confrontation, but on its ability to operate through established systems with precision and control. The full impact of this counteroffensive reached its peak not in public debates or court hearings, but quietly within the internal systems of the British state, where Princess Anne oversaw a methodical restructuring of how the Sussexes were recognized at an institutional level. While Meghan Markle continued focusing on public narratives, media production, and commercial positioning, the monarchy responded in a far more subtle but decisive way, by redefining official status itself. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about classification. Under Anne's direction, key offices within the royal household, including the Lord Chamberlain's office and Buckingham Palace's digital teams, initiated a comprehensive update of official records and public-facing platforms. This process went far beyond simply removing profiles. It was a complete reorganization of identity within the system. The Sussex family members, including Prince Harry and their children, were moved from the category of active working royals into a newly defined archival section labeled as individuals no longer representing the sovereign. Their biographies were reduced to historical summaries, with timelines that effectively ended at the point of their departure from official duties. Current roles, honors, and affiliations were removed, leaving only past associations. This change carried a strong signal, especially for global audiences and investors who closely watch official recognition. It indicated that, from the perspective of the British state, the Sussex branch was no longer part of the monarchy's present structure but had become part of its recorded history. For Meghan's broader strategy, this created a serious challenge. Her efforts to build projects like Citizens of Nowhere relied heavily on maintaining a visible connection to active royal identity. But with this digital reclassification, that connection appeared increasingly distant. The narrative shifted, from a current conflict within the royal family to a story about individuals who were no longer officially involved. Public interest, which had been driven by immediacy and relevance, began to lose some of its intensity as the situation started to feel more settled in the eyes of the institution. Anne's approach demonstrated something fundamental. The monarchy maintains control not just through titles or ceremonies, but through its ability to define legitimacy at the source. Without that official recognition, even widely discussed claims or media portrayals lose a degree of authority. Alongside these digital updates, steps were also taken to manage the physical and historical representation of the Sussexes within royal collections. Official portraits, commemorative items, and archival materials connected to their time as working royals were reorganized within internal storage systems, reducing their public visibility. This wasn't about erasing history, but about placing it in context, presenting it as a concluded chapter rather than an ongoing one. The effect was symbolic but meaningful, reinforcing the idea that their role within the monarchy had a defined beginning and end. Another important layer of this transition involved practical changes to how status was reflected in international settings. Adjustments were made to ensure that the Sussexes' classification as private individuals was consistently recognized across government and diplomatic channels. This influenced how they were received in official contexts, including security arrangements and protocol considerations, aligning those interactions with their updated status. For Meghan, this represented more than a symbolic shift. It had real implications for how she could navigate global networks where formal recognition often shapes access. Through all of these actions, and demonstrated a different kind of strategy, one that didn't rely on public statements or visible confrontation, but on structural decisions that quietly reshaped the entire situation. Instead of directly engaging with the narrative being built around the Sussex brand, the monarchy focused on defining its own position with clarity and consistency. In doing so, it reduced the space for ambiguity, making it increasingly difficult for alternative interpretations to carry the same weight. By the end of this phase, the conflict had moved beyond headlines and into systems, where long-term outcomes are often decided not by visibility, but by how institutions choose to define and record reality. The final phase of this unfolding conflict came not with a dramatic public showdown, but through a gradual and unmistakable shift in momentum that ultimately favored the institution over the individual. As the pressure from Princess Anne's coordinated strategy continued to build, Meghan Markle began to face the reality that her approach, centered on legal challenges, branding, and narrative influence, was colliding with a system designed to endure far beyond any single dispute. Financially, the impact became increasingly visible. The ambitious plans for a large-scale lifestyle brand, which depended heavily on investor confidence and the perceived strength of royal association, started to lose stability. Potential partners and backers grew cautious, not necessarily because of a single legal threat, but due to the accumulation of risks, legal uncertainty, reputational debates, and the clear involvement of the British state in protecting its institutional framework. What had once appeared to be a high-value opportunity began to look more complex and less predictable, leading to hesitation in funding and slower progress in negotiations. At the same time, her major media project, Citizens of Nowhere, entered a challenging environment. The earlier strategy had relied on capturing immediate public attention and framing the situation as an ongoing, emotionally charged conflict. However, as official records were updated and the monarchy's position became more clearly defined, the narrative began to shift. Instead of a live dispute, audiences were increasingly viewing it as a resolved or settled matter from an institutional perspective. This change affected how the project was perceived, reducing some of the urgency and impact that had initially driven interest. In political and social circles, similar patterns began to emerge. Connections that once seemed promising became more distant, as individuals and organizations weighed the broader implications of involvement. Maintaining strong relationships with established institutions, including the United Kingdom, remained a priority for many, and this influenced how openly support could be expressed. As a result, Meghan found herself operating in a space where influence was more limited than expected, particularly in areas where formal recognition and long-standing alliances carry significant weight. Perhaps the most significant realization in this stage was the nature of the system she was engaging with. The challenge was not simply about individuals like King Charles III or Prince William, but about an institution with deeply rooted structures, processes, and global connections. Princess Anne's role highlighted this clearly. Her approach was not reactive or emotional, but methodical and grounded in existing frameworks of law, trade, and diplomacy. By addressing each aspect of the situation, commercial, legal, political, and institutional, she reduced the effectiveness of strategies that relied on speed, visibility, and market-driven influence. As this chapter moved toward its conclusion, the outcome reflected a broader principle. While modern tools like branding, media, and intellectual property can create powerful opportunities, they operate within a larger environment shaped by long-standing systems. The monarchy, with its established structure and ability to define official status, demonstrated that its strength lies not in immediate reactions, but in consistency and control over time. For Meghan, this phase marked a turning point, where the limits of her strategy became clearer, and where the balance between individual initiative and institutional authority was fully revealed. By the time this conflict moved into its final stage, the outcome was no longer being shaped by headlines or public statements, but by quiet shifts in influence, capital, and long-term positioning. Meghan Markle, who had built her strategy around legal leverage, branding power, and narrative control, now faced a situation where those tools were losing effectiveness against a deeply rooted institutional system. The financial side showed the clearest signs first. The large-scale vision of a multi-million-dollar lifestyle empire, which depended heavily on investor confidence and the perceived strength of royal association, began to slow down significantly. Investors who had initially been drawn by the global appeal of royal-linked branding started reassessing the risks, especially as legal uncertainties and institutional pushback became more visible. What once looked like a high-growth opportunity started to appear unstable, leading to delays, cautious negotiations, and in some cases, complete withdrawal of interest. At the same time, her media efforts, particularly projects like Citizens of Nowhere, faced a changing audience perception. Earlier, the narrative had been driven by immediacy and emotional engagement, but as the monarchy clarified its official stance and restructured its public records, the story began to feel less like an ongoing conflict and more like a closed chapter. This shift reduced the sense of urgency that had originally captured public attention, making it harder for the content to generate the same level of impact or engagement. In political and elite social circles, a similar pattern unfolded. Relationships that once seemed promising became more distant, not necessarily due to direct opposition, but because of broader strategic considerations. Many influential figures and institutions prioritized stability and long-standing alliances, particularly those connected to the United Kingdom, which made open support a more complicated decision. As a result, Meghan found herself operating with less external backing than anticipated, especially in environments where formal recognition and institutional alignment play a key role. One of the most defining aspects of this phase was the growing clarity around the nature of the challenge she had taken on. It became evident that this was never just about individuals like King Charles III or Prince William, but about an entire system designed to maintain continuity over generations. The role of Princess Anne highlighted this even further. Her approach remained steady, structured, and focused on long-term outcomes rather than short-term reactions. By addressing the situation across multiple dimensions, legal, commercial, diplomatic, and institutional, she effectively reduced the impact of strategies that relied on speed, public attention, and market momentum. As everything settled, the broader picture became clear. The balance between individual initiative and institutional authority had shifted firmly in favor of the latter. Meghan's approach demonstrated how modern tools like branding, intellectual property, and media influence can create powerful opportunities, but also how those tools can face limits when they intersect with long-established systems that control official recognition and legitimacy. In the end, this phase was less about a dramatic conclusion and more about a gradual realization, one where influence, perception, and opportunity were reshaped not by a single decisive moment, but by a series of steady, structural changes that defined the final direction of the entire situation. As this long and complex situation moved toward its final outcome, the resolution didn't arrive through a dramatic courtroom decision or a public confrontation, but through a quiet and steady withdrawal of influence across multiple fronts. Meghan Markle, who had built her entire strategy around the idea that pressure, whether legal, commercial, or narrative, would eventually force a response, instead found herself facing a system that simply absorbed that pressure without shifting. The financial consequences became impossible to ignore. The vision of a high-value global brand, once supported by strong investor interest and market excitement, began to weaken as legal complications and institutional resistance created uncertainty. Investors, especially those operating at large scales, tend to prioritize stability, and the ongoing conflict introduced too many unpredictable variables. As a result, funding slowed down, partnerships became hesitant, and projects that once seemed ready to launch entered a state of delay or reconsideration. At the same time, her media narrative faced a similar transformation. What was initially positioned as a powerful and emotional story began to lose its intensity as the monarchy's official stance became clearer and more firmly established. Instead of an active struggle, the situation started to appear resolved from an institutional point of view, which reduced the urgency that drives large-scale audience engagement. This shift affected how her projects were received, making it harder to sustain the same level of public attention and emotional investment. In influential political and social environments, the pattern repeated itself. Connections that once held potential value became more distant, not through direct rejection, but through careful recalibration. Many individuals and organizations chose to align with established systems rather than uncertain outcomes, especially when long-term relationships and international considerations were involved. This left Meghan operating in a space where influence was still present, but no longer as strong or as widely supported as before. The most important realization in this stage was about scale and structure. The challenge was never limited to individuals like King Charles III or Prince William. It was about an institution designed to function across generations. Princess Anne's role continued to reflect this reality. Her actions were not driven by public perception or short-term reactions, but by a consistent application of institutional mechanisms that gradually reshaped the entire landscape. By the time this phase concluded, the direction was clear. The influence of branding, media, and legal strategy, while powerful, had reached its limits when placed against a system that controls official recognition and historical record. Meghan's approach demonstrated how modern tools can challenge traditional structures, but also how those structures can respond without direct confrontation, relying instead on stability, continuity, and control over time. In the end, the conclusion was not defined by a single decisive moment, but by a gradual shift where opportunities narrowed, influence adjusted, and the balance between personal ambition and institutional authority settled into a new, more defined reality. As the situation approached its final conclusion, what stood out most was not a dramatic ending, but a slow and undeniable shift in control, where influence quietly moved away from Meghan Markle and back toward the institution she had tried to challenge. The strategy she built, combining legal pressure, brand expansion, and narrative storytelling, had initially created momentum, but over time, that momentum began to fade under the weight of a system designed to outlast short-term disruption. Financially, the impact became clearer with each passing phase. The large-scale vision of a global lifestyle empire, once backed by strong expectations and investor curiosity, started to lose its foundation. As legal complexities increased and institutional resistance became more visible, investors began stepping back, not out of disinterest, but out of caution. High-value ventures depend heavily on predictability, and the ongoing uncertainty made long-term commitments far more difficult. What once looked like a fast-growing opportunity gradually turned into a high-risk environment, slowing progress and limiting expansion. At the same time, her media narrative faced a similar challenge. Projects designed to capture public attention relied heavily on a sense of ongoing conflict, but as the monarchy clarified its position and reinforced its decisions, the story began to feel less immediate. Audiences tend to engage most with unfolding events, and as the situation appeared more settled from an official standpoint, the emotional intensity that once drove engagement began to decrease. This shift didn't erase interest, but it reduced its scale and urgency, making it harder to maintain the same level of global attention. In political and elite circles, the pattern remained consistent. Relationships that once seemed promising became more reserved, shaped by broader considerations of stability and long-term alignment. Many influential figures and institutions chose to maintain strong connections with established systems, particularly those linked to the United Kingdom, rather than engage deeply in a situation with uncertain outcomes. This left Meghan in a position where her reach still existed, but its effectiveness was noticeably reduced. One of the most defining realizations in this stage was understanding the nature of the system she had confronted. It was never just about individuals like King Charles III or Prince William, but about a structure built on continuity, tradition, and global recognition. The role of Princess Anne continued to highlight this difference. Her approach remained consistent, focused on long-term outcomes rather than immediate reactions, and grounded in established frameworks that operate beyond public attention. By addressing the situation across legal, economic, diplomatic, and institutional levels, she ensured that the response was not just reactive, but sustainable. As everything settled into place, the broader outcome became clear. The tools of modern influence, branding, media, and intellectual property, proved powerful, but not absolute. When placed against an institution that defines legitimacy and controls its own historical and official narrative, those tools faced clear limitations. Meghan's journey through this conflict ultimately showed how ambition and strategy can challenge existing systems, but also how those systems can respond by relying on their core strengths, stability, structure, and the ability to shape reality over time. In the end, the conclusion was less about victory or defeat, and more about a rebalancing of power, where the lines between personal influence and institutional authority became firmly defined. As the final stage of this unfolding conflict settled into place, the outcome became less about active confrontation and more about the long-term consequences of competing systems of power. Meghan Markle, who had attempted to reshape her position through a combination of legal strategy, branding control, and narrative influence, ultimately found herself facing the limits of those tools when placed against an institution built on continuity and global recognition. The financial trajectory of her ambitions was the first area where this reality became fully visible. The vision of a large-scale international lifestyle brand, once supported by strong investor interest and high expectations, gradually lost momentum as uncertainty increased. Legal disputes, institutional pushback, and reputational complexity created a layered risk environment that made long-term investment more difficult to justify. As a result, funding pipelines slowed, partnerships became more cautious, and expansion plans were repeatedly reassessed rather than executed at the original pace. In the media space, the same pattern unfolded in a different form. Projects designed around storytelling and public engagement depended heavily on immediacy and emotional connection. However, as the position of the monarchy became more formally defined and stabilized, the narrative surrounding the situation began to lose its sense of ongoing urgency. What had once been perceived as a developing conflict increasingly appeared, from an institutional perspective, as a resolved matter with established outcomes. This shift naturally reduced the intensity of global attention, making it more difficult for media projects tied to that narrative to maintain the same level of impact or cultural momentum. In political and elite networks, the recalibration was equally significant. Engagement from influential figures and organizations became more measured, shaped by broader considerations of stability, diplomatic alignment, and long-term institutional relationships. Many actors within these circles prioritized maintaining consistent ties with established structures, particularly those associated with the United Kingdom, rather than becoming deeply involved in a situation marked by legal and reputational complexity. This resulted in a gradual narrowing of external support, leaving Meghan with influence that still existed, but operated within more constrained boundaries. At the center of this entire dynamic remained the contrast between individual strategy and institutional endurance. Figures like King Charles III and Prince William represented continuity within a system designed to function beyond personal disputes or short-term disruptions. The role of Princess Anne continued to reflect that principle most clearly. Her approach was steady, structured, and rooted in institutional mechanisms rather than reactive measures, ensuring that each response reinforced the broader framework rather than destabilizing it. By the end of this process, the overall outcome was defined not by a single decisive event, but by a gradual realignment of influence. Modern tools such as branding, intellectual property, and media narrative proved capable of generating significant attention and opportunity, but they ultimately operated within boundaries set by deeper institutional systems. Those systems, built on recognition, continuity, and structural authority, responded not through confrontation, but through consistency over time. In that sense, the conclusion of the situation was not dramatic. It was structural. It reflected a final stabilization where roles became clearer, influence became more defined, and the balance between personal ambition and institutional power settled into a fixed and lasting form.